Well, now, as usual, we will collect questions. First, Roberto Teixeira. I would like to ask you to introduce yourselves very briefly so the panelists know who you are.
Roberto Teixeira da Costa. I'm an economist and the founder of the Brazilian Center for Economic Relations. In this scenario described, how you see challenges and benefits for Brazil in this scenario? What are the advantages we can take? What are the risks that we can assume?
A second question before we get back to Ambassador César Amaral. Alguém pode trazer o microfone aqui, por favor?
Sérgio Amaral, I'm a former Brazilian ambassador, and I'm now the chairman of the China-Brazil Business Council. First of all, congratulations for your presentations. I don't know whether we can take a clear conclusion from them, and I don't know whether we have a good answer to the issue which has been raised. What I find is very interesting is that at the end of the day, both China and the United States tend to say similar things. If we take what the Chinese say, and I would remind Jean Vigent, who has been one of the authors of China's foreign policy doctrine, let's have a peaceful rise, and let's try to build convergences with the world, with different countries, namely with the United States. What does the United States say? I'll take the words of Joe Nye, who says, and I think this is the US doctrine, let's engage and at the same time make a hedge. And this is what both have been doing, believing that if we build bridges, everybody will accept China's emergence. And what does the United States say? Let's engage. Because if we engage China in trade, in investment, in cultural exchange, China will transform itself. And that may become closer to the West, and eventually adopt our system, our international system. Now, this is not happening. And this is not happening because there's a kind of escalation of suspicion. And I think you are right, and I think you pointed out to that too, saying if things continue like that, we're going to have a different kind of Cold War, but it will be a sentiment like that. Now, if the assumptions of both countries are apparently similar, but if their expectations are quite different, there's no way engagement may work. And I wonder what your effort to build up a new vision and a better understanding. The United States understands the inevitability of China's emergence. And China understands that the United States will keep being a superpower, whether this effort can really succeed, taking into account the inexorable process which is underway.
Thank you. I think we have enough food for thought, so I think you should take these questions and answer them, and then we can go to a second round. If
Sam, you want to take the part about risks and benefits for Brazil, and then I'll take the other.
Okay, whatever. Yeah. You want?
Go ahead.
all right.
I think Brazil and Latin American countries are in a is a really good position now in the current U.S.-China relations. Of course, if these two countries work together, even better. But it's really in a very good position because China has such huge foreign reserves. And also they have successfully developed their economy, has such huge need for raw resources and the market, which also the Latin American countries and Brazil is in need. So there are a lot of complementary relationship between China and the U.S. and Latin American and Brazil. U.S. has not paid enough attention to this area. U.S. has got problems with a lot of leftist countries. So China's, in that context, find this opportunity to come in this area. I think these countries should welcome to work with China. I will not see any problems to work with China. Just be aware of China has U.S. competition in mind, but I don't think that's a big deal here.
And I'll speak to the ambassador's question because I'm very sympathetic with your point of view. In the summer of 2011, I suggested that whoever was elected in 2012, the summer of 2012, I suggested that whoever's elected should invite the president of China for an early and deep discussion of these fundamental issues, because there's a lot that leaders can achieve in terms of mutual understanding of restraint as well as opportunity. And if the leaders don't get it, it will be driven by forces that will have their own interests at heart. In America, we have a constant pressure from the military-industrial complex. The leader of the China caucus in the American Congress comes from the district in the United States that builds the most warships. Every day he issues a press release saying China's fleet is moving. We need more ships to compete with them. And if the administration is not speaking on the bigger picture, that becomes the dominant theme. And increasingly over the last, since September of last year, the dominant themes with respect to Chinese behavior, both near China and farther afield, has been driven by the neocon rhetoric. And the administration has not chosen to provide a balancing narrative of where America's interests lie and where our need for confrontation can be managed. You talked about the question of engaging in hedging. I prefer the phrase that comes from American constitutional history and which is understandable to most people, called checks and balances. We can work with you, but if you start to push against us, we will balance against you. And I think that that is something that Chinese understand very clearly, and most governments understand. And it doesn't mean I'm against you, but if things go the way they're going, you're going to get a response, and it's going to be a serious response. Now, I think that it's entirely possible for the leaders, especially in the United States, to take a more magnanimous view of where American interests lie. Our energy independence is better than it's been since the 1930s. Our economy grew at 4% the first 2 quarters. We're out of that recession. We have the social problems, the political problems, but we've had them before. And we've met challenges like this before. If you live long enough, you remember, the Germans and Japanese in the 30s. You remember the Japanese economic threat, which people took to be a strategic threat in the 1980s. And of course, we had the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War period. We managed, even under periods of containment, to find ways for our navies and air forces to be near each other without being in conflict. And I think this is underscored by the overhang of the nuclear threat, which leaders on both sides understand very clearly. The nuclear weapons make warfare directly between us not an option. Therefore, the big question is, how do we avoid proxy warfare through third countries or fourth countries? China is very poorly positioned to engage in proxy warfare. They don't have trusting allies and friends. Even Burma, Myanmar, which was heavily interdependent with China and very weak militarily and isolated internationally, but for China and North Korea. Even Burma in 2011 said, enough. China, back off. We don't want to be embraced so tightly by China. We're going to reach out to the rest of the world. I think that's a very good example of where the future lies if we maintain calm, we articulate to our people and the world at large that we can work with China if China's willing to work with us. The benefits are there. And then you don't have to state the alternative, which is if China refuses to work and it pushes against the system will resist what China's trying to do. And if you go back to the broad strategic picture of where China sits in the world, despite the accumulated reserves, despite the energies they have in their economy, they also face a demographic cliff in 2035, 2040. Their population dramatically becomes older. And they have to make enormous shifts to go from being a middle-income country to something more successful. The successful examples of middle-income transition to higher income are three: South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. Very small, nothing like 1.3 billion people, continental-sized country. So I think China can do it. They can make that transition, but it's a bigger transition challenge for them than anybody's seen previously. So let's help focus their energies back on that and try to find ways of managing the competition. And if people want to talk about how to manage that specifics of the competition, I'll be happy to speak more to that.
Good. Felipe Hashtag y el embajador Juan Santos.
I'm an economist, energy economist slightly. So one comment and one question. One comment, I was amazed when for professional reason, I had to read a report on a National Institute of Energy, Chinese official policy. And I was amazed by the terms that they were mentioning, the revolution of shale gas in US and its effect on the policy, on environmental policy of the US, deciding now, since they have shale and they've reduced dramatically their emission, and the emission is dramatic, that was a strong menace against China because China is so much dependent on coal. So now the US will be changing, that will be put in an official document very aggressively that that was something against China. And I was amazed. This is happening, in fact, and so this is just a comment to complement your questions. The question itself is you spoke, both of us, you spoke about trade, but you didn't mention so much about the complementarity between the two economies, in fact, and it somehow it reminds me of the story of the scorpion and the boatman, and the complementarity are so strong in terms of markets and cost of living in the US and employment in China. That could you elaborate a little bit? So you have on one side a huge complementarity, and then there's this strong suspicion and military build-up, but how it doesn't fit very well, the two together.
Anyone else? Aki, here.
Well, gentlemen, Colonel Mauricio, Brazilian Army. Just arrived from a master's degree on National Defense University, Beijing. And one of the things I would like to hear from you, gentlemen, is because in one point of view, trying to seek the way the Americans think and the path ahead of us in the political side, the gentleman elaborated that doesn't matter who, but probably we will see some kind of tougher positions towards China in the near future. It's a guess for sure. But I'd like to hear from you, sir, what is your hinge on the internal question of China? Because what I saw there was, okay, there is a concern with the US, but mainly not to be contained in its resources, the broader meaning of resources word, not only economic resources, to tackle internal problems. I got a feeling on a very important concern of Chinese government with income imbalance, with how the Chinese people will deal with this new openness on the new technological era. Would you please try to give us an approach like that on what's the path ahead the Chinese government?
Good. Anyone else? I would like to add a question myself, if you allow me, just to explore a little bit more let's say the ideological component of the relationship, and it's linked to the question that was raised by him. In my view, and I'm not an expert on China by no means, but in my view, there's this fear. It's fear of being contained by the U.S. and also the fear of being contaminated by Western ideology. Right? I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that, because in the face of growing criticism against the Communist Party and corruption and that kind of stuff, and I think the government issued a document number 39, if my memory serves me well, and warning against the threat of international agents trying to infiltrate ideologically Chinese society in order to put in check the political system and the Chinese society and Chinese values. And I think there's two different fears of being contained in its rise as a global power, and the fear of contamination. They're kind of intertwined.
I'll respond to bits and pieces of the three questioners. On the question of the shale gas, it's really quite interesting how you saw this perception of a threat from the American shale industry. But I kind of know the leaders of the Chinese oil industry pretty well. We play golf together, and that's how you get to know people in my world. and
Do they play well or not?
no, they're terrible, but they really enjoy themselves. That's the thing.
Once you bid them, they're fine.
That's right. Well, they won't bet money. These guys have very complex views. It's not so simple. There's a company called Sinopec, which is huge in the Chinese market. It's been losing money for decades because it's forced to sell consumers at prices below production costs. They've received direction from the top to expand their production to go out of China.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
And they've been going abroad. They're very interested in your offshore capacity here off Brazil. They're very interested in going lots of places. Well, nobody has noticed. They bought 23% of Chesapeake Oil, which is America's leading shale producer. They never tried to buy 51%, and then Congress would say, oh, you're taking over our shale industry. They wanted the technology. They wanted access to the know-how to make this happen in China, because China has about equal reserves of shale gas, but structured differently in Chinese subsoils. And so it's going to take the most advanced Western technologies plus a little something different to get it out of China. But there's much more promise there, much more understanding that the amount of water needed to inject to achieve gas reduction, gas release is much less than they had thought, and therefore more reasonable in a water-short society like China. And so I think that what you may have seen, I hope, was an aberration, but when it counts, where actually the oil people are making decisions, they're being very pragmatic and sensible. And they've been expanding their pragmatism over time. It used to be they wouldn't involve themselves with foreign companies. Increasingly, they discovered that the foreign companies were the way to get the technology needed for them to do what they have to do, and that insisting on total sovereignty and control would defeat their objective, and they become more accommodating. On the complementarity versus, the complementarity between our economies is so manifest. Our public representatives of industry speak all the time on this, but their voices are not as loud and as interesting to the media as the combative, the military focus, the international tensions, and it's the job of the administration to bring that to a higher level. Obama will, in November, make a state visit plus a participation in the APEC forum in Beijing. Beijing will host this year. And at that time, you will see some very modest steps. The Chinese and the US have worked pretty effectively on new climate change regulations. A good example, a year ago, China abandoned its plans to build new chlorofluorocarbon capabilities for refrigeration and to join the Montreal Protocol. China had to abandon a newly built plant for CFCs that hadn't even been brought into production in order to make this commitment. So I think it should be appreciated that it's quite significant. And there'll also be some non-traditional energy production cooperation announced. Most of it won't get any headlines or notice, but there are some efforts to try to develop this. It's in my view, the administration's responsibility to talk less about these areas of friction and to try to rechannel discussions into areas where we can express with greater self-confidence the fact that we believe we're moving in the right direction and counter the always present narrative of friction and competition that journalism loves. They need that for their stories to sell. And industries need it for their particular interests. And if the administration doesn't do it, who will? It's got to be done by the leadership of the country with strategic foresight. I'll let you jump in. No, contamination, I mean.
Okay.
But you can take any of those topics.
Let me also start from the trade issue here. Doc mentioned on the U.S. side, the mutual benefit has been recognized by the business community, not by the general public. In China, is a similar situation. I really amazed talking to Chinese economists from talking to those general public, totally different pictures. Even talking to the Commerce Department people, they give you one view which is so different from the Foreign Ministry people. Because the economists and the commerce people, they have a much clearer understanding of the mutual benefit. But those views are not sexy enough to get into the public domain. So the misperceptions are so strong. Even those professors in Peking University I had last 2 months ago, I was so messed by those accusations of the American try to transform all those pollution to China, because they just put all those sunset industries into China. Why U.S. economy is going so well so far? Because China lend money for U.S. economy. Why U.S. fighting war has so much money in Iraq? Because China lent money to the U.S. All those misperceptions, especially one issue I found very interesting about TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. For quite a while, when I was going to China, up to last year, every presentation I did, this issue always came up. They said U.S. wanted to contain China not only on the security military front, also in the economic front. TPP came up as an example because U.S. tried to lure all those Asian countries into a trade bloc which excludes China. That was the argument. They all said that's part of U.S. containment strategy. But up to last year, until last year, I found the tone changed because Commerce Ministry, they came up, said we studied the TPP, which in fact is good for China. Yeah, they said China should join it. It's not something U.S. could exclude China. It's if China could meet the standard, the high standard of 21st century trade liberalization negotiation, that's what they came up. And even Minister of Commerce at that time was so eager, said in 3 years we should join that. He now is the head of the Cross Taiwan Strait Foundation. I just early this year, I was in Beijing watching TV. He talked about TV. China still said China should now get into this negotiation as soon as possible, because if China does not get into, China will lose another opportunity to be part of making international rules, trade rules, norms, which are set by those negotiations. And China would be in between of industrialized countries and developing countries. Both sides would blame China. So they came to that point. So I asked them, how did you, I talked to foreign ministry person early this year, asked her, she studied this, I asked her, what's going on there? She said, when this came out, the Chinese instinct was, another thing against China. Is scared. They did not study that, did not understand it, so they became scared. When they began to study it, to learn about all those information, they eventually came to the conclusion that it's not what they thought at first. So the misperception, miscommunication, or not have good information, sometimes mislead the public. Although all those mutual benefits, they don't see it. Even for the buying U.S. Treasury, all those securities, the Chinese has so many misperceptions. I just don't want to take too much time on that. On the domestic challenge front, I think Doug also mentioned some of them. The Chinese leaders, just like American leaders, 80% of their time are spent on domestic issues, not on foreign relations. Although Xi Jinping now, I find he became more and more fond of external relations because a show off for him, how those people respect Chinese power. Now he went to Netherlands. Those are two Air Force, the F-16 came to escort Chinese, the Air Force One. He was so proud. Came to Brazil, to these countries. His treatment like pop. He is really, really enjoying that. But still, I think domestic issues are the top priority for them. In fact, China's rise, I think, is we cannot take that for granted. China could derail at a time. That's what I think Xi Jinping came to realize at this point. He came to for the anti-corruption, all those things. One thing he talked so much is that there are some 颠覆性的错误 could subversive mistakes China could make, would subvert not only China's regime, but China's rise. So how to respond to those issues? One is, of course, you concentrate, try to work hard on resolve those problems, demographic, economic, corruption, all those problems. Another is to divert the domestic attention to foreign problems. Why we are in the, that's what I was so mad talking to Chinese counterparts. They always blame everything on America. Why Japan became so aggressive? It's not aggressive, but they thought aggressive because US behind Japan. Why Philippines, such a small country, could fight for its interests against China because United States. Why China had all those economic problems, including pollution, all came from the United States. So that's another problem makes Chinese public and the Chinese government taking the U.S. issue as one issue which not supposed to be that way. Ideology. I think Chinese leaders are, I think, become more and more ideological. Xi Jinping, I thought Jiang Zemin at that time was so bad. Now I could look back, was much more moderate. Hu Jintao I thought was very bad, comparing with Xi Jinping today. The control over internet, control over the academia, control over news media, everything. Xi Jinping now is doing so, hardliner because he is so kind of more type of leadership, build a strong personal power. How to build that strong personal power? Part of that is to strengthen, enhance control. Why those can control? Part of is afraid of those ideological, Western ideology try to undermine its regime. In fact, last year there was a very famous, or infamous movie, documentary from the Chinese National Defense University, the silence trial of strength between China and the U.S. Basically, the central theme was U.S. would do everything to undermine the regime legitimacy. U.S. would go after China just like U.S. did after the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern European countries, eventually try to overthrow the Communist Party regime to bring the Western ideology, Western political system, multi-party competition, all those things into China. So China now is talking about, still backward against universal values. That was when Yabao talking about universal value. Now Xi Jinping is so firm, no universal value. It's China model. Xi Jinping is promoting so strongly about China model, 三个自信, 3 confidences, 理论自信, 制度自信, and 道路自信. The Chinese theory, which is confident. Chinese theory, which is confident. Chinese road. He emphasized China road. Every country has its own way of modernization. China has its own way, which is not influenced by the Western ideology, Western countries. So that's what he has been emphasized.
Let me just correct a mistake of mine before you talk. I've skipped it. Ambassador Juan, who was eager to...
Do I have time or?
Just very concise.
Okay, okay. Well, I am Juan Santos. I am an ambassador of Spain, retired, and I am a diplomat of the Cold War. So I was posted in Russia from 75 to 78. Sorry, in the Soviet Union, then in Yugoslavia from 78 to 80, and Cuba from 86 to 89. So I will make 2 comments and then 1 question. Well, first of all,
Very briefly, because we
yes.
kind of running
Well, this is why I'm asking if I have time. As far as conflict is concerned, I'm shocked about the success of communism in China. So this is an area where I see some conflict in the projection of the model. Let's say we have seen many American failures projecting their democratic models. And we have this Chinese model now that can be, adapted in many countries. So there I see an area of conflict. As far as cooperation is concerned, you said that, the Chinese leadership, they are quite sensible people, they think very carefully. So is there any possibility that they could be partners, as in the old times, with the United States to establish, the old balance of power that we are missing now? And my question is about the alliance with Russia that you mentioned. This, agreement they have signed of 400 million tons for the years to come. Well, listen, I see that the alliance between Russia and China, well, it's a little bit against nature. So I don't see that the complex, the inferiority complex that the Russians have, they are not going to be happy being a petrostate that will, they will become a sort of third world country supplying oil to a, big power as China that is going to give in return high technology, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think it was short.
Good. So concluding remarks and then
Well, just to speak to the ambassadors, I agree completely with you. This is an unnatural temporary alliance because of the Chinese opportunism taking advantage of the isolation that Putin is bringing on himself with his neighbors. I want to congratulate the colonel for having the courage to go off to China and get a degree at National Defense University. The head of that school produced the film he was talking about, General Liu, and so you were thrown in with that. And on this question of, I've got a peculiar point of view, and others may likely not share it. I spend a lot of time with the people who are responsible for trying to implement the very sweeping reforms in the economy, society, military in China, at the top. They look around and see nothing but unhappiness, resistance to what they're trying to do, except in the financial banking area, where the people in charge are reformers by nature. But they see opponents, passive opponents throughout the system. One of the reasons they believe they must look tough in foreign affairs is to reinforce the message not to foreigners, but to their own people, that you cannot resist what we're trying to do, that we're going to keep pushing, that you may resist us for the next 2 years, but at the next party Congress, we're going to get rid of a lot of these people who are fighting against us. So their preoccupation really is domestic, and I think it has a foreign affairs component, not in the sense that they have to be tough with foreigners for its own sake, but be tough with foreigners for purposes of reinforcing their strength internally.
Good.
On that ground, let me, for example, the Chinese general staff visiting Washington last month, you saw his performance. He talked 40 minutes in the Pentagon, and Joint Chief of Staff only talked about 10 minutes. I asked people why he talked that way. They said, of course, he's looking at the Chinese embassy people down on the audience, what the report. That person will write back to Beijing. That's what in their mind. They talk about those crazy ideas. They're not talking to Americans. Of course, the audience will take it, but that's what he talked back to Xi Jinping. They have all now to pledge loyalty to Xi Jinping. What Xi Jinping said is the military should have 招之即来，来之能战，战之能胜。When you are caught, you can come. When you come, you can fight. When you fight, you can win. That's what Xi Jinping is talking about. They use identical language. All those language talking to Xi Jinping. When Chang Wanquan talked to Secretary Hager in Beijing, that's what humiliating to Americans. But talking to Chinese, no, that's not for American. That's for Xi Jinping, to let him to listen to. But that's so dangerous. That's really a dangerous situation in China, I found. I was in Beijing last month talking a military two-star journal. That person was so rational, but he was not able to talk publicly. Then we talked about Japan issue. I said, why China hates Japan so much? He said, is that the case? Then he called a waiter. In the restaurant we had lunch, he called a waiter. Said, get the boy in. That boy came in. Asked that boy, do you hate Japanese? He said, of course, I hate Japanese. They are bad people. Then, are you going to fight against Japanese? Of course, I will fight against Japanese. Then that person asked him, how many Japanese did you meet? He said, oh, yeah, I have 2 friends, Japanese. Are they bad people? No, they are my buddies. I invite to my house, my home. Then, did you ever meet bad Japanese? He said, no. So, see, that's the case. That person demonstrated to me. See, this is China. These people are so clear, but those veterans, those young people don't get it.
Thank you so much. Obrigado pela presença de vocês. Thank you both, Doug and Zal.